There is no point seeing the Odyssey in any format other than 70mm IMAX, says many people on the internet, I think. And do they have a point? So Chris Nolan's The Odyssey is hyped for being one of the most spectacular films ever made, the first film to be shot entirely in IMAX. But if you're not watching it in IMAX, are you missing out? And how much are you missing out? And is that an issue? So I wanted to discuss what the differences are between the IMAX format and some of the other formats, and also some of the kind of problems that shooting in IMAX entails when it's released in other formats. So the main thing with this film is it's the first film to be shot in, the first feature film, to be shot in conventional 70mm IMAX. And IMAX has a very square aspect ratio. The reason is IMAX cinemas always made a big thing about their screens being very, very tall. When you go into an IMAX cinema, you enter low below the screen and the screen looms above you. And if you ever look at any marketing of IMAX screens, they always explain how tall the screen is. It's always about height. This screen is 7 stories high. This screen is 8 stories high. This screen is the height of 4 double-decker buses, whatever. It's about height. And so to maximize the height of the image, you are dwarfed by this enormous screen that has a very square aspect ratio. So not quite 4:3, but almost. It's 1.43 to 1. Very, very square. Now that's great, and in any IMAX cinema in that format, you're going to be watching this enormous spectacle with the screen looming over your head. But the problem is most other cinemas moved away from square aspect ratios in the 1950s. Like early cinema was all very square, but in the 1950s we had what was basically a widescreen revolution where formats like Cinerama, CinemaScope, Super Panavision, Ultra Panavision, VistaVision came out, and those formats pushed cinema into a widescreen aspect ratio. Widescreen was also an immersive format, also very popular, and that's what cinemas have standardized on. So most auditoriums around the world will have a widescreen screen. Now the issue is that's incompatible with a square IMAX frame. So if we want to screen the Odyssey, which was shot very square, very IMAX, on a conventional screen, well, it doesn't fit. So if we were to just plonk the image in the middle with no cropping, let's say, okay, fine, we don't want to lose any image, we just project it on, we'll project the square IMAX frame on a widescreen image. That's not really going to be very practical, because you end up with a lot of wasted space at the side of the screen and the overall image will be tiny. Like if you've ever seen 4:3 projected in a widescreen cinema, the image always looks disappointingly tiny. So what the filmmakers have done is they've decided to crop the image. So the Odyssey will have been zoomed in and top to fill the full width of the widescreen screen, and the tops and bottom are cropped. Now, that's potentially a problem because, okay, we've got a lovely full image. The screen is now filled with the movie. It's as big as it could possibly be, but we're not seeing the same frame that IMAX audiences are. It's being reformatted for the screen. Now, is that a problem? And I think a lot of people have issues with it, and I think that's why a lot of people are saying, like, you have to see it in IMAX, you have to see it in IMAX film, because if you don't, you're going to see some cropped version. And many digital IMAX screens also don't have the full height screen. They crop it to about 1.9 to 1. So you're still losing some image. So cropping is not new. Anyone that grew up in the VHS era of the 1980s and 1990s would have been watching cropped movies. So I used to be very frustrated watching movies when I was younger on VHS because I knew that they were these wonderful widescreen epics that had the sides cropped, and now we're watching a version where the composition has been ruined and the film, I'm missing out on half the image. And you could always tell that the composition was always cluttered and you always felt that you were missing something. So I'm quite sensitive around the idea of cropping because I always want to feel like I'm seeing the full image. So the idea that I'm only seeing a part of the frame just drives me nuts. Like this some people are fine with it, some people don't mind, but I have just far too much baggage. Like, I would be so frustrated watching films that I knew were cropped. If I knew they were cropped, I would, if I saw like the text going off the edge of the screen or the framing looked weird, it would just make me angry. So I'm sort of a little bit skeptical around the approach for the Odyssey in that the theatrical version is cropped. Now, the filmmakers will argue that it's not as bad as the horrible VHS days, because rather than it being done by some random person at the TV channel, the VHS duplicators, the cropping is being done carefully with intent, and they will have shot the film carefully to think about the different framing. And that is true. Like, I'm sure when they were shooting it in IMAX, they were also thinking like, okay, well, how would this shot work and on different aspect ratios? But it's still a compromise. So in my day job, I'm also a filmmaker, and in the commercial world, you often are being asked to deliver content for multiple aspect ratios. Like, particularly if you're doing for socials, they might want something that works on 16:9 for YouTube, 1:1 or 5:1 for Instagram, and then 9:16 for TikTok. And somehow you've got to accommodate all of those ratios within one shot. And it's always a compromise. There'll be a shot that works better than others, and there will always be a better or worse aspect ratio. And I imagine if Chris Nolan's going to all this effort to shoot this film in IMAX, that he's prioritizing the IMAX aspect ratio, and it might be that the other more cropped ratios are a little bit compromised. So that's a thing to think about. The other point that a few people have mentioned online, and it's a thing that I've noticed as well, is how much the film is cropped in theatrical. So cinemas actually tend to have two different aspect ratios. Like, most cinemas can do two different formats, and they do a 2.39:1, which is a CinemaScope format, which is the most widescreen. It's the widest format that most cinemas do. And they do a 1.85:1, which is a less widescreen format, and it's almost the same as 16:9. And most cinemas have screens with either movable masking that allow them to adjust the shape of the screen to accommodate these two formats, or they have like the right zoom lenses within the digital projectors to do those two formats. So if the film is shot in the square at IMAX and you were going to crop it for theatrical, the obvious choice would be, we should crop it the least amount. And cropping the film least amount would be cropping down to 1.85:1, because that is a taller ratio, needs less of a crop. But strangely, the digital and 35mm releases of this film are going out in the 2.39:1 ratio, which is a much more extreme crop. And that's odd, because you think if you wanted to preserve as much of the composition as possible, you wouldn't crop as much. And there's no reason to crop down to 2.39, because every cinema can play 1.85. Like, there's no compromise. It's basically a button on the projector. They can do both. So why would you do such an extreme crop? Surely if it was released in 1.85 in cinemas, then it would be closer. Like, it would still be a compromise, but it'd be a better compromise. I don't know why they would do this. I have a theory, and I think the theory is that they wanted the IMAX to be the bigger, the taller, the better. So 1.85 is closer to IMAX, and it's harder to upsell the difference if the difference is less apparent. I wonder if there's some kind of like IMAX rule that IMAX has to be the tallest or the biggest format, because 1.85 is actually taller than IMAX digital. So you would get a bigger image in a conventional theatre in that format than you do in an IMAX. So I wonder if there's like a political reason for that, as well as a creative reason. And I think, that's something that's worth mentioning. But also, the other point is, although, yes, seeing the film in IMAX is the best way to go, most of us can't see it in IMAX. Like, there's only 42 screens in the world showing it in the 70mm format, and there's not many more digital IMAXs showing it in the full height format. I would say definitely less than 100. So that means for most people, they might not have a cinema in their country that can show that format, or like in my case, the nearest cinema is a 2-hour drive away and it's sold out. I can't go. There's no way I could see this at the moment in IMAX. I either see it in Cropper Vision at the multiplex or I don't see it. And I do think I would be frustrated personally watching it in a multiplex, thinking like, I'm really missing out on the IMAX thing. Like for me, it just wasn't practical to get to the IMAX screening. I'd want to go, but I think for many people that's the same. And although the film is prioritizing IMAX, it's sort of doing a disservice to everyone else, because the vast majority of people watching the film are missing out on a lot. And particularly by doing this crop down to 2.35 or 2.39, sorry, like we're intentionally seeing less for no reason, and I'm slightly frustrated by that idea. But anyway, I think it's an interesting thing to discuss, and I'd love to hear your comments. So please, let's have a chat about it, and see what the rest of you think. Have you seen it in IMAX? Have you seen it in the multiplex? What did you think? Anyway, thanks for watching, and until next time, bye.